waiting. We're waiting. We're waiting. Welcome to the Prairie Comics Festival panel on writing for comics. The Prairie Comics Festival is an amazing Winnipeg festival where we bring creator-focused ideas literally to the table to talk about how comics get made. I'm so pleased to be with what is essentially a murderer's row of creators from Winnipeg and abroad. I will introduce the panel to say that writing for comics is nuanced. It's a many and varied, multifaceted discipline, and each of these people is going to have a different way that they approach it, either as an illustrator writer, as a writer-letterer, as a cartoonist. Sometimes people make that bold distinction, right? A way to bring drama or comedy to the table. So without further ado, what I'm going to ask each of you to do for the sake of your own shameless self-promotion is to introduce yourself, say your full name, the camera's going to pull onto you, and it'll also show off your newest, most available work, which I think is great. So why don't you introduce yourself and then give us the slug line or pitch for your book, and that'll be a good way for the audience to meet each of you, and then I'll dig into the subtle art of writing for comics. All right? We'll start at the end.
Hello, my name is Johnnie Christmas. I am the author of Swim Team. Swim Team is about Bree. She's a kid who moves to a new school, and the only available elective left is Swim 101, but Bree's got a secret. Bree doesn't know how to swim. She's deathly afraid of the pool, and when she almost drowns, she does take swimming lessons. She starts to realize that she actually is getting pretty good at it, builds her confidence, and she joins the school swim team, and then the book has a whole second life from there. It's been a wonderful experience writing for, this is my first book for young readers, and it's been a really wonderful experience in terms of the craft of writing and also in communicating ideas to a totally different audience.
Amazing. Next on the roster.
My name is Lyndon Radchenka. I am the writer and letterer of The Laundryman, which is a thriller graphic novel series that I co-created with artist Stephen Call. It follows two mercenary monster hunters who work out of a laundromat and solve supernatural mysteries. We commonly liken it to Ghostbusters meets the X-Files with a touch of supernatural. And we sell copies online at infinitestudio.ca.
My name's Ryan Harby. I'm an author and illustrator. This is my latest book, Awkward Pause. It's a collection of non-sequential comedy comics, web comics. A lot of the stuff that I do inside and outside of this book is all stuff that's kind of oddball, kind of humor, bad timing, just kind of like really silly stuff. So obviously a lot of serious subject matter to talk about, but yeah, no, that's kind of what the book that I can talk about, but more broadly, I'm interested in talking about kind of like comic writing in terms of whether or not you're geared toward character, plot, or something beyond that.
Hello, my name is William O'Donnell. I'm part of a collaborative comic writing team called Yak and Shadow. I am the shadow portion. Yak is a gentleman named Bart Rachinsky. We have an ongoing webcomic called One Shot Left, card game that came from that's called Surplus of Popes, which is basically just 98 comics that you can play as a game. And my latest creation is Super. These came from my ThinkBone 2 Turbo, which is just additional comedy that hasn't found an exact home in our webcomic format, so it ended up in a book.
My name is Mark Allard-Will. I'm a writer out of Saskatoon, and my latest work is Siegfried Dragonslayer. It's a reimagining of the Volsunga saga from Norse mythology, partial inspiration for Tolkien's The Hobbit, and the entire inspiration for Richard Wagner's Der Ring des Nibelungen. And what makes it quite unique is it's actually painted with coffee, so it's kind of fine art meets arts and crafts, I guess. And it was my foray into fantasy, something I've wanted to do for the longest time.
Well done. I won't bother to introduce myself since my role here is narrator, but I do write and illustrate comics, and I won't give you any hard pitches for them. You can just zoom in tight on this instead. Gentlemen, we're going to do this first portion by show of hands so that the audience can get a sense of the constituent parts of our stories. So if you only write but do not illustrate, raise your hand. If you write and illustrate, raise your hand. If you've written for other illustrators but you also illustrate, raise your hand. Right? So I think that these are really important distinctions to be made when we're talking about writing for comics, because how you ask someone to do something often depends on whether or not you've done it yourself, right? And what that path going forward is. So let's also ask by show of hands, how many of you do full scripts? Yes. How many of you, do what we would call a treatment or a rough outline? Yeah. As well, yeah. And this one is a truth-telling. This is the truth-telling portion of the show. Raise your hand if your book has ever actually followed the plan all the way to the end. You liars!
I'm cheating though.
Either you're all lying or I'm the worst at making comics that anyone here is. Okay, so this is a general question. So by the twinkle in your eye, I'll decide who will answer it next. All right? When you're writing for comics, which is separate from pitching them, tell me how you know you've got an idea worth developing. Mark, tell us about your idea.
So for me, it's if I can write a plot development, so I write a full plot outline or plot development before I'll go into the script. If it answers all of the what's, the when's, the where's, the how's, that's literally it. That's literally how I know it's worth developing out into a full script, because I've tried to do it before I've answered those questions with a plot outline, and it ends up being disastrous. So for me, a plot development is absolutely key and pivotal. And I've decided that because I write everything graphic novel length, I don't do single issues, I really have to answer those questions first.
I'm going to reframe that question a little bit and throw it at you, Ryan, because as they say in the business, drama is easy, but comedy is hard. And many of the Awkward Pause comics are kind of single moments that have an entire idea and a punchline. How do you get at that?
Well, I first want to say that I feel like I cheated your question a little bit. The reason why I feel like...
Typical cartoonist.
Yeah, right? I'm taking shortcuts here and there, but the reason why I feel like at least the book was kind of the same or kind of followed the path that I expected, it's obvious this is an anthology, right? So like I have an idea of what it should look like and how all the components should come together. But yeah, like when you're talking about an individual piece here, there's a lot that can go into it, but mostly there's a lot of like compromise that can go into it because you're trying to reduce a message down so much, especially if you're doing like something that's just non-sequential, that's just a one-off. You're really trying to get like something that could be a long message like bite-sized as much as possible. It makes you think about your job as an editor the entire time that you're doing it too, visually and with the writing. But yeah, no, I think I kind of got lost in the weeds of your question.
So, well, we'll continue through the weeds, but we'll stay on comedy because we have two people self-professed using comedy as a weapon in their writing. Now, in dramatic works, you can often say, oh, is that what you saw in it? The work is richer as a result. But in comedy, if no one laughs, you know immediately if it was missed the mark. How do you, as writers, know that an idea that's funny to you may be funny to others? How do you workshop that? How do you share it?
Definitely you need to hone your confidence in that. That's definitely part of it. But there's also different types, right? Like there's a really short form comic, for example. Like it'll be the same as just a quick setup punchline joke most often. And that can kind of communicate what you're talking about, and that can give you that feedback right away of somebody laughs or somebody doesn't, or a reaction, whether
So
or
you're
not
working backwards from a punchline? Or towards the punchline?
well, I don't know.
Good answer.
I don't
actually.
know if I don't know if I've thought about that, but I will say that there is a difference between that and writing comedy that is a little bit more character based over a long period of time, where you don't always know where the laugh is going to be from somebody. You know, sometimes the laugh is just in this terrible situation that's happening, but that might be funny at different points to somebody. You know,
Funny in
if
its
they-
awfulness?
Yeah. If you know certain characters and you know what their foibles are and that sort of thing, then over a long period of time, like those things can really tickle you at different moments for different people. So I'm finding that an interesting thing to kind of tackle, like on more long-term comedy writing, is just less obvious punchlines, but more just kind of like satirical writing, I guess.
Simmer us in your own juices.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, even I just kind of wanted to play off of what you were talking about with using your characters. I find when writing something dramatic, the characters are victims of whatever the story is going to be, because the drama or the horror, whatever comes that isn't comedic, has to be in the story. It can't just be inherently in the character themselves, unless you're composing like a slasher where everything around them doesn't mean as much. It's just about who the scary main person is. But I find when writing comedy, I let the characters take me on that journey, so the story will change more than the characters. Whereas if I'm writing something dramatic, the characters will change more than the story. So if that I find with comedy, it can be almost a little bit of a relief, and sometimes it does have a bit of that cheating feel, where if you create a character that amuses you, you just let them go off into an adventure, and definitely that goes into like, again, I feel like I'm backpedaling on how I answered about, do I see, is it going to finish where I thought it was going to be? The longer the story is, the less I know where it's going to end up, because I let the characters run amok, and by the end of it, well, I don't even know when the end is going to come. That's another point. So the characters get to drive it, whereas I'm just along for the ride.
I just want to add on to that, because that's related to something that I've been thinking about a lot too, and I agree with what you're saying, is that specific, and I don't even know if it's specific to comedy, but specifically like character-driven stuff. I mean, it would be really hard if you didn't have a sense of putting whatever character in a scenario and knowing immediately how they're going to react to it. I mean, it's kind of simple writing in a way once you kind of know the character. But on the flip side, that's something that I kind of struggle with, is maybe something that I did a lot more in the past, is like try to rely on something that would happen in a plot and have that affect characters rather than them being the instrument of the story.
Oh, this is a good point, because it brings us to one thing I wanted to bring up with you, Mr. Christmas. We call Johnny Lord Christmas around here, just so you know, yes. Swim Team is a departure for you from, why don't you give the people watching a little background on maybe Tartarus or Firebug, the kind of work that you're coming out of as you went into Swim Team?
Sure. So a lot of the work that I've done, almost everything is different than anything before, and that's not by design. I've just been kind of following my curiosity, and it's sort of worked out that way. My first series with Image was Sheltered, which was kind of like a crime story / coming of age. And then Angel Capper with Margaret Atwood was like kind of a golden age reminiscent superhero adventure. Then Firebug was a volcano goddess fantasy. Tartarus was a sci-fi epic, with mother and daughter. One person's warlord is the other person's freedom fighter kind of thing. So Crima was a love romance around coffee and ghosts. So don't ask me to make sense of how any of that. The thread that connects all of that is curiosity. I just get leading from the question that you asked earlier and that Mike addressed was kind of when these ideas come and how do you tackle them and approach them. I think sometimes, and with all of these ideas, the ones that I wrote with Sheltered, I came up with Ed, and with Angel Capper, it was Margaret's idea. But with the others, the inception of an idea will come, but it won't go away. It'll just keep coming back. I'll be in the shower, I'll be washing dishes, or whatever it is, and it just keeps coming back and back. And then usually what'll happen is another idea will arise that it juxtaposes perfectly with it, and then it becomes completely irresistible. And at that point, it starts writing itself almost, kind of.
So you're a puzzle solver when you're writing.
Pretty much, yeah. But I try not to look for things. And so I have this notes list that's insane with all these ideas, and sometimes one will connect with the other in a way that's kind of like a Reese's peanut butter cup. Chocolate and peanut butter. Oh my goodness, it's irresistible. But chocolate on its own or peanut butter on its own just wouldn't have done it. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
No, you are, and I'll follow up a little bit. So we talk in our studio a little bit about how stories might have lots of different parts, but each part should poetically rhyme with each other part of the story. And that's sort of when I'm writing, I'm looking for which parts rhyme with each other, either visually, emotionally, or actually verbally and visually. But when you were doing Swim Team, this is a completely different audience, a different piece, but I think it connects to what our comedians were talking about knowing the character at its core first before you know what they find funny.
Absolutely.
Tell us about what it's like to write a main character or protagonist through this lens of which I have never been, I've never been a young girl trying to get on a swim team and not know how to swim.
Right.
I don't think you have either.
No, I have not. But so my way in was that I was a kid who fell in the pool and almost drowned, and that fear lives with me still. I've taken the swim classes and all that, but the fear is still there. And it just wouldn't leave me alone. So I tried to avoid telling the story. I avoided it a million different ways. And the more I avoided it, the stronger it got. And then I had the character Bree for a totally different story in which she knew how to swim really well. And finally I was like, okay, I need to approach this story about when I almost drowned. But I didn't want to do an autobio. I'm a little shy about that sort of thing. So I was thinking who would be a good character for that. And then I was like, oh, Bree, the character I have from the other thing. What if I took everything away from her? But she was very headstrong and very determined. And if she had my situation, how would she react? And then all of a sudden that started writing itself kind of in that kind of way. So that was my way into understanding Bree. And then I had to try and figure out the other things about being a young girl in middle school, which I never was. But I would give myself all these little set points to try and understand the character. I started seeing the world I started looking at doorknobs and thinking, okay, this is where her eye line is. So if this is where my eye line is, this is how I see the world. How does that feel? How do I walk through the world that way? And I just had all these little
did you have to
exercises.
redraw a dozen pages as soon as you discovered that?
No. But it did help me inform the way, recapture that feeling of being a kid and that powerlessness, which also tied into other themes of the story about the powerlessness around the water, et cetera, et cetera. So just, I didn't need to understand everything. I just needed enough to make it convincing, because in all stories, you don't see every meal a character eats or how they, do they wash with a rag or just with soap? Or we don't see all of that stuff, but we know enough about them to know enough about them.
So this leads me nicely into Mark and Lyndon, because you're talking about the human core piece. And even though both of their pitches were mythological, high-minded, high pitches, both stories have in their hearts the human side, the underlying drama. So Lyndon, why don't you talk about a story for the dear listeners? Lyndon and I have had this talk a lot about the importance of a character being a character before a character goes on an adventure. And whenever we're pitching stuff, he goes, yeah, but why should I care about them? So why don't you tell us how you make us care about the characters in Laundryman?
That's a really difficult question. And I don't appreciate that my first question is so difficult.
You had all this warm-up. You got to be here.
Yes, so I do have, or I try to at least have a proclivity for character-driven story, because my opinion on genre fiction of any kind is that without an emotional core to it, it's just it's just wallpaper. I find genre to be the perfect vehicle to decorate and reshape the issues that are really important to me, and I look at the things that drive characters and drive myself and scare us and motivate us, but at the same time, I don't want to hand a book to my friends and them look at me and say, this is you, because that's not what I'm in. That's not what I'm in it for. So when I approach a story, and to answer your first question, I find the stories that grab me the most or that keep me the most motivated are the ones that feel like they're arriving in my mind fully formed. Now, no story is ever fully formed the first time you think of it, but when it feels like it's fully formed, there's something in that feeling that really propels me forward. And through revision and through rethinking and further reflection, you kind of shape the nuance of the characters and the nuance of the challenges, and you can look at ways in which the characteristics of your character can be pushed against and the decisions that they're forced to make, and that's how I shape the plot. Like, I find in my storytelling that character transformation is always the driving force, and I use the plot to insert those challenges to the characters, because without a character transforming throughout a story, at least in the types of stories that I make, there's no feeling to it.
So for my part, what I kind of find, I'll answer this in two parts. I'll answer specifically about Siegfried, because that did present very unique challenges in terms of character development, bearing in mind that this came from Norse stanza. So the way that Norse mythology was originally delivered, and you probably know this, right? Originally it would have been a drunk poet, like a bard, in a mead hall who would have delivered this as this great grand performance. So the idea of humanizing the character was very, very secondary to telling the story of the world. But I'll begin with, how do I approach characters and humanize them for drama in comics and in scripts in general, is I really just put myself in the shoes of the character. How would I emotionally respond to this agitation or this endorsement or this whatever is happening? And then really answer that with how I write the character and how they maneuver in the world, bearing in mind that I discussed before about always making the plot development or plot outline. I know what I'm going to bring in as conflict, but how would I feel about this if I put myself in the shoes of this character, knowing the parameters of the character I've made? Now, with Siegfried, or, as an adaptation of the Volsunga saga, I had that unique challenge of the characters are not entirely formed. So really, when I looked at my main protagonist, Siegfried, I really had to kind of think about, well, what's a prince, like a rich kid, right? How's he going to respond to this world and to being told by Reagan that there's this dragon out here, and to really make your way in the world, you've got to go and slay this dragon. I really approached it that the story begins with him being really petulant and quite aloof to the world, because he's been born into this world of wealth and power. But by the end, with this really brutal twist that happens at the end of the story, he has really felt the full emotion of the world, the isolation of the world that he's gone out into, bearing in mind he's going out into tundra and out into what they call the Nita Plains, where he's going to go and slay this dragon where nobody lives. It's inhospitable. And so he's really been taken out of that world and taken into like the brutalism of the real world. And so kind of really viewing it as, how would somebody respond to really being taught School of Hard Knocks about the world outside of their comfortable little bubble. And that's really how I approached that, and really how I kind of created the humanism of the characters.
Good answers, all. Now, we have done the lofty service to your writing personas. I would like to get down into the mechanics, the nitty-gritty, if you will, of making stuff. I want to talk about panels and pages in writing for comics. All right? So the first general question is, and we can do this by show of hands, when you're thinking about your comics, do you first think of pages or panels? So if you think first in a constituent space for time, of panel to panel, as you're telling your story, raise your hand. All right? Now, if you're thinking about the page and the page turn as the primary tool of comics, raise your hand. All right, so I think we've divided the room beautifully, and now we can discuss. So whatever side you're on, I would love for you to discuss your merits and your point of view on that. And we might as well start with you, Mr. O'Donnell, because I think we missed you in the last round. Bad moderator, bad.
He was a comedian.
Yeah, I was in the comedy section. The the delightful little opening that we had. Yeah, exactly.
All right, so tell us, panels or pages?
They only write things that are serious. Anyways.
It's all bad.
Right, you had a question.
Panels or pages?
I was on the pages side. I think that answer really comes from just how I've always experienced comics, and I never had the greatest sort of attention span, and so I would always flip through comics and look at just the grand images all together. And most comics, like from when I was little to now, I do a lot of like flipping through and looking at how the book flows, seeing the art. Then I'll go back and actually read the dialogue, read all the text. And so I think about that energetic dynamic. I really love when a book makes me want to turn the page, but also I love when it grabs you too. And certain panels can do that, but I look at the page. And it also then, with that, going into the mechanics of creating things that in the script format, like seeing those, the imageless words ahead of you, it was really interesting to explore what panels can mean. Like if a page is just one page, there's no additional panels, what does that mean? Because it means so much when you're reading a story. It interrupts or explodes stories at times.
And if I may also expand on that, when you see a comic page, you open the page to the two-page spread, there's no surprises now. You've seen at a glance everything that's going to happen on those 2 pages, and you want to know what happens next. And the reward is you have to read it to now know what happens next, and so the surprise is intact only if you carry on.
Exactly. It's all contained there, unless it's League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, in which case there's a billion Victorian Easter eggs in that single page that you have to find, and you will never know what they mean unless you are Alan Moore. That aside,
we did a circle of protection around the Prairie Comics Festival, so we can actually invoke the name Alan Moore without worrying about any counter curses that may arrive. So you're fine. You can.
Oh, that's good. His spells are many and vast. But yeah, so with the structure of it, just it goes. I found it went beyond what a page or the panels can mean, just because it all got more and more meaning the more I got into the like ugly mechanics. What seemed laborious at first of just like even just typing page 1, panel B, and getting the structure. And honestly, it helped to write film script style first. I find that was a really great gateway into using the mechanics to your advantage. So even something like, Bob's house, exterior, night, you find yourself getting a little bit excited. It's the most mundane detail of what the scene has, but all of a sudden you put that down, you're like, you know what, I'm picturing it, and I want them to picture it, and this is great. So you find yourself getting excited about those little details. So as much as I'm very pro-page, the nitty-gritty of the panels gets more exciting the more you get into it. I'm answering like 7 questions you didn't ask me.
At the same time. No, I like it. Okay, who's up next? I see Johnny's got a twinkle in his eye. Pages or panels? Which do you prefer?
I do pages because I outline pretty robustly. So when I'm breaking down the outline into a page layout, I know that I've got meat on every page. I want to divvy it out so that every page justifies itself in the narrative. Like if it doesn't belong here, then scrap it and move along.
Let's pause there before you leap over that. How do you define that to yourself in that writing for comics mode? There needs to be something on this page, and there isn't. Let's imagine a page you're looking at on your outline that doesn't have it.
Yeah.
What's your method to put it in?
There's got to be something interesting about the character, some revelation, or it has to have, or the plot has to move along. There's got to be some discovery on every page, or at least at the very least, it's got to be laying down track to get us somewhere. So I want every page to be satisfying enough to move the reader to the next one. And then within every page, I try to use the panels as a little mini story within the story. So I want it to be propulsive. I want to move you from one panel to the next that will get you to a surprise, hopefully at the end of that page, to propel you to the next page. And then at the page turn, like everything is on that page turn, because we've all been at that point where we stopped reading a book because we didn't turn that page. So like I live and die on a page turn. Like it has to work. Or someone might put it down, I'll go get a sandwich, and they may never come back to your book ever again. So everything you've labored over means nothing. So page, but then the panel is almost like like when people say it's like playing jazz. It's kind of like playing jazz. Like from your outlining, if you're an outliner, or at least if you know your story, you know where it's supposed to go. But on the panels within a page, you can now play "Oh Canada" with an oboe. Like now you can experiment. You know how it goes, so now you get to play around with it and make it kind of interesting enough to go is that an oboe that they're playing with it? Maybe I'll see
the
what's
link
on the
below
next
this
page.
video for the "Oh Canada" in oboe selection.
Yes, absolutely.
Curated by Johnnie Christmas.
Yeah, I've got many. I've got a whole playlist. But yeah, so they work in tandem, But if you're going top down, I would the power's in the page, because then also if you're using color in your work, you can set tone and mood so much on spreads and on the page, right? So if someone turns the page and these colors are all cool colors, it gives your reader, it sets them up for a sort of feeling, as you were saying about Bob's house, exterior night. Like it sets a tone, right? So if they turn the page, as you were saying about seeing the story at a glance, these are really warm colors. And in the preceding pages, our characters things were heating up, and emotionally, say, right? Seeing those warm colors will help. And thinking about the page in that way, utilizes all the tools that are at your disposal to make this thing work for you. Like everything that's a challenge is also is something that you can use to help tell a story.
Okay, that gives me a thought, unless someone wants to jump in on pages and panels. You feel like really viscerally. Yeah, you do. I see it. You do, Ryan.
Not viscerally. No, I was just going to change my answer.
You're going to change your answer?
Yeah.
Again, the most mercurial of the panel answerers, Ryan Harby.
I had originally... I like that. I had originally said that I go panel by panel, but it's just because for a lot of my work I don't consider a page, but there is a page to my work a lot of the time, which is if I'm going to be making, especially a short comic that gets published online first, then the page is essentially the readability. Like how much does somebody actually see when they are on their phone, their computer, whatever, like where does it start and where does it stop, and that's where my editing has to happen, like the same way that you would for a page. Like how much can somebody consistently see on whatever the social media platforms are, where's like the sweet spot, and how do I make that the parameters of essentially reforming a page to do that.
So you're really working from an infinite canvas first in some ways, and having to add your own constraints because you're using the internet.
Well, I think the infinite canvas came probably when I was earlier in my comic writing, where I was much less disciplined, and just like you just pay the price at some point for having no parameters, and some people can only see the first couple panels or whatever it is. You ultimately have to figure out your format. So yeah, that's me changing my answer.
All right.
And I think that's a good place where I jump in also. I find that I start from the end and I work to the beginning. So when I'm starting on a project and I have a story outline, I like to first look at what the full length of the final product is going to look like, or have some sense of that idea. And whether that is a 120-page graphic novel or that's a 22-page floppy comic, I find that what I do is I look at scenes rather than pages. So I'll look at my outline and I'll break down the composite scenes that make up the story, and I'll, based on my experience, estimate how long I think that scene is going to take. And whether it's a 4-page scene or a 6-page scene or an 8-page scene, I build the skeleton of my project around building those scenes together before getting into the minutia of what a single page is going to look like, if that makes sense.
No, it does. Something to add? Yes.
So you may have noticed that I was the one who put my hand up for both panels and pages, and that's because I begin with panels, and my experience with writing for comics is, or as a writer in general, I come from an education in screenwriting. So for me, the panel is all about staging, about visual staging. And with screenwriting, they always tell you, never direct, just write the screenplay. But with comics, we absolutely cheat and we absolutely direct if you're writing full script, right? And so I often think, like what Johnny was saying about, okay, I've staged the visual environment for the panels, and I've thought about that, but then I want to think about revealing. So I've done my, so with your story pace, I like to do revealing, so from your right turn into your next left page. If the conflict rises a little bit, I absolutely want to begin that section on the next left turn, or the next left-leaning page, so that there's a visual excitement that joins the story pacing.
Good answers. Gentlemen, you have so far acquitted yourselves well in our Prairie Comics panel. But now I'm going to start asking some difficult questions as we wend our way towards the end. This one is for the writers on the panel, the writers that are directing their ideas from the script to the panel. How much information do you provide? This is a good segue from what we're doing here. How much information do you think you need to provide? And how much is too much? There's always too much.
I provide no art direction whatsoever. So
Expand on that.
On a script page, you may, on a full script, for example, I'll include, panel 1, panel 2, panel 3, and then in 3 sentences or less, I will include the actions of what is going on. Person X runs across the room. Person Y looks surprised. And then below that, I will include the dialogue. X says this, Y says that. Move on to the next panel. I'm not an artist. I have no authority on the composition of a panel or the best way to make it flow through a page. As long as the artist is conveying the general sense of action on the page and it fits the feeling that exists in that script, I'm happy with collaborating on the final process of the work.
Do you find that has proven to mean that more often than not you have revisions at the end of a project, or do you live with what the artist provides?
I'm actually quite happy and often pleasantly surprised, by the way, by what the artist provides, because it provides a perspective that I may not have considered when drafting the script. And as someone who does their own lettering, it gives me the power to look at what parts of my script are no longer necessary in the dialogue or in the action because they've been conveyed in a different way by the art. And when it comes to comics, being someone who isn't a visual artist or an illustrator, that's where the magic of making comics comes from. It's two people with different minds collaborating on the same project in a way that a single person with a single vision would not come up with that final piece.
An alchemy, if you will. All right, so anyone else care to tell me how much is too much for a panel description? Now I'm leading the questions.
Yeah. I got thinking about the amount that I put into mine, I'll admit, depends on who I'm working with, because I have varying levels of trust with different collaborators. And,
we've all been hurt before.
And I say that in the most compassionate way possible. That more just in the sense of Sometimes it's a practical thing in that I have to add more details because the person I'm collaborating with, their English isn't their first language. So I'm trying to convey something to them that might take details I wouldn't normally think of, so I have to compound it a little bit to get it across, because when they come back to me, I really hate the idea of asking anything to be changed. And but I don't want to add too much, because I do love the collaborative side of, I've written something down, I have a certain vision for it, but I also, and when I say my varying levels of trust, I say that by saying, or what I mean to say is, I tend to trust the artist more than I trust myself in the way of structuring things. They have, studied and refined their styles to a really magical way, and so when I give them something that gives me they have an idea, I assume they're on the same wavelength. If we weren't, we wouldn't be collaborating to begin with. And then when they come back to me with something, they'll have improved it, because there might be something impractical that I put in there, like this sort of angle or the way you describe the shot seems sort of cinematic. So I now turn that into 3 different panels that have a different sense of movement than what you originally conveyed to me. So now that one panel has become an entire page that you described, but now the story moves in a very different way, and I love that I just trusted that they will know where the story should go and what would be visually interesting for it.
A good bit of truth talk here for anyone writing for comics is that what takes you 10 minutes to write down takes that artist sometimes 2 days to bring to life. And so for you to then flippantly ask for a course correction perhaps is disingenuous to the idea that comics is primarily a visual medium. It's absolutely a collaboration between writers and illustrators and letterers and graphic designers and book designers. It's the whole gestalt that goes on. But if you're not putting that faith in the visual, then perhaps you need a different medium to be working in. I feel we've exhausted that question, so I'll ask you another painful one. Right? I want to talk about cuts. When you have to make cuts to your script, some of you have talked about it when the art comes in. Oh, I can remove these words. Some of you have talked about making the cut early in the designing process. I'm laying out the page. Oh, I have to cut this. There's not enough happening. And some of you have talked about it in terms of, is the idea fully formed enough? Have I got there enough? I have to make those cuts. But I want to talk now about that important part. You've turned it in, the publisher has given you feedback, and now there's no choice but to kill some darlings. Does anyone have a story about having to kill a darling or two in their creative process that you're willing to share? Oh, he reached for the microphone.
Yeah, I've had, I don't know about any particular stories to protect the guilty, but yeah, there have been some darlings that have been killed that I can still feel them. Like they're still part of the story in like the director's cut that lives in my head. But for the sake of clarity or for the sake of page count, they had to go. But if it has a lot of heart in those scenes, I will fight for them and try to find a compromise, because sometimes I'm not super sentimental about things. I'm very vicious about cutting. I'm the first one to like kill all the darlings in the room, like if it doesn't work. But sometimes the core of a story lies in something that's a little bit immaterial. So like in Swim Team, there's a scene where Bree's in the pool and it feels infinite. There's almost like no walls on any side. And I needed to convey that because that was the heart of the story for me. Like when I fell in, it felt it could have been like 3 feet of water. I don't know, but for me, it felt like it was like completely like I was in the bottom of the ocean, and I wanted to have a page that was a splash page of the kid.
No pun intended.
No pun intended. In the middle, and that was from that point was where and I've never written like this before, but that was kind of the point in which I wrote the story, going from that point forward and that point back. But to convey that. In any other way than to have that image in there, it just had to be in there. And that was something that, I don't think it was fought over, but it was something like that in another context would be fought over.
Right.
But it would be hard to justify it in a way that it's spoken. But But there's lots of other things that get ripped up and torn out that you feel strongly about, but you let them go.
Actually, I got reminded. I thought, oh, I don't have one of those stories. I have a story where the point where the darling was the entire project itself.
My condolences.
Yeah, and again, I'll do my best to censor to protect whomever is out there, because they are out there and they might be listening. And there was a comic adaptation of a film that I was working on, and it was moving along at a dreamy pace where I was throwing out ideas for it to like the film company, the film people behind the film who had to give final approval, and also to who was publishing it, and also any collaborators. And I was really churning along with a particular artist, and everything I came up with that they liked, it was great. If they had some feedback, it was wonderful. And it was all coming together, page after page was getting completed. They were getting so far along. And then somewhere in there, the people behind the film decided to ask other people who were involved in the film but weren't involved in the comic, like, hey, maybe we should get their 2 cents on it because they were a part of it. And what that became was this bombardment of alternative scripts. So it wasn't that they came in, like, I understand, like...
Suddenly you had a multiverse of scripts to try
Well,
to
it was
make
basically everyone trying to say, I can do this better. And not that they could, I thought they couldn't, but they still would, instead of coming up with notes or trying to do punch-up, which happens a lot in film, especially in comedy, you'll have punch-up sessions, which is fine. If certain scenes need a couple extra jokes, fair play. But when they submit entire, like, 8-page portion scripts of, like, how about this segment should go here? How about that? And, like, that's not what we were asking for. But then all of a sudden, because they're closely connected to the people that have final approval, they were getting a little bit more clout of, like, oh, well, maybe try this one. And they would all come back to me as kind of, I then became an editor, no longer the writer of this comic book. And I'm like, okay, I still have portions here that are drawn. I assume they're still in it, but now I have to reconform everything else around these brand new, completely brand new ideas, and what should be drawn, what should be used. And then I'd still try to semi-generously, work on their scripts to make them work, because they didn't understand how panels or anything, like, they didn't understand the mechanics of it. They'd wrote some things that would take 30 pages to tell, and they thought, oh, but you can handle that. It's like, well, no, comics, it has to be a certain amount. And it just was back and forth to the point where it just ground to a complete halt. Everyone was unhappy, and then the other people had to move on. The publishers had to move on. The film people had to move on. And I then was forced to move on with these gorgeous pages that are still sitting on my computer of a project that will never be. And it was just too many cooks got into the kitchen. And yeah, The Darling itself was the entire project. The whole book was just axed completely.
Because, and we're coming up to the end of our Prairie Comics panel on writing, so this is sort of a final thoughts moment. But because comics is first and foremost presented as a collaboration, sometimes at the production level or at the publisher level, that can be seen as an invitation for committee decisions and committee level decisions on storytelling, which is the opposite of collaboration, right? It's akin to the band in the recording studio, right? And someone shouting lyrics from outside the booth, right? It doesn't work. People think that they can improve it that way, but it generally doesn't work. So, for those of you who are curious about getting into comics, making comics, standing by your collaborators, a really good thing I would suggest that you do is look at the work of these individuals. Check out many of them have a number of projects where they've attempted a number of different styles of writing, different attempts at storytelling, and see that collaboration is a multifaceted tool, and not every story fits every type of collaboration. So this is us at Prairie Comics Festival signing off. This has been our panel about writers. Please come back tomorrow where we have more fun creator-led comics discussions. You can wave, guys. Wave. Everyone's clapping.